Welcome everyone. Welcome everyone to our next Chebacco chat, visiting with Thomas Urquhart, who has a new book out called Up for Grabs. It was recently, I believe yesterday, reviewed in the Bangor Daily News, and it is on the public lands in the state of Maine. So when I think of public lands, I tend to think of places like a Wyoming or Montana, where you have that real visible public land presence in the Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management. So what do you mean by the Maine public lands?
Well, literally, as I think you've sort of implied, the public lands are those lands that are owned by the state. But I don't think many people always think of public lands that way. I think sometimes they just think of them as the lands nobody owns. There's no private landowner. As you point out, here in the Northeast, we're not accustomed to thinking in terms of large chunks of land owned by the federal government. So, but in reality, the public lands are lands that have not been sold or have been bought back by the government. When what is now Maine was discovered by the Europeans, they found about 20 million acres of wild land. They probably didn't know it, but that's how much it was. And eventually, in the course of a couple of hundred years, His Majesty's Massachusetts Bay Colony took charge of it all and called that land his. And from then on, having taken all this land, it was the government's policy to dispose of it as quickly and for as much money as they possibly could. So let me put up here. Oh, wait a minute, I gotta get the screen share. And how do we start? Oh, there we go. Okay.
There you go.
All right. And okay. There we go. Thank you. So let me put up this slide here, which was by forest economist Lloyd Erland, who knows as much about the history of the Maine woods as anybody. You can see we started off with the 20 million acres, and by the time that Massachusetts came along, they had got rid of 4 million of it. Mostly that was given to, as grants that would hopefully be settled. It was given to officials as awards or friends of officials as gifts, and also to speculators like the famous Samuel Waldo and the Waldo patent. Most of the land in the colonial era was along the coast, and they just went progressively east in terms of settling it. The Commonwealth inherited 16 million, and before Maine became a state, it continued to dispose of the land and left Maine in 1820 with 10 million acres. Well, I mean, let's just think about 10 million acres. That is the size of Switzerland. Maine continued the policy of trying to dispose of it all. It is important to say that they, when I say dispose of it, they wanted both the funds from selling the land, and they also wanted the increased tax base that settling it would have. So it wasn't just we want to throw away the land. There was thought behind it. And in fact, as you can see on Lloyd's drawing there, that by 1875, 78, basically all of the public land had been sold. For that reason, Lloyd calls it the era of disposal.
Okay, so you said that all of the public lands were mostly gone by 1875, but the diagram still shows 2% of the land left. So 400,000 acres is quite a large chunk of land. So where were they?
Well, very good question. And you've actually put your finger on the central theme of my book, which basically is um, the public lots, or officially the public reserved lands. You're right, 400,000 acres is a large chunk of land. Unfortunately, this particular chunk of land was made up of 1,000-acre lots spread all over northern Maine. And it reminds me a little bit of, if anybody is a Monty Python fan, of the skit about the man who's trying to sell a large amount of string that he has inherited. How exciting, says the agent, who is John Cleese. However, the man explains, due to bad planning, the 122,000 miles of string is in 3-inch lengths. So it's not very useful. You may want to know how all that happened.
Yes, we'd be very interested in how that happened.
Unit of all of these land transactions, which was the township, conceived as a square 6 by square miles, 6 by 6 miles square, and these were laid out on a grid, pretty much innocent of anything that was actually happening on the ground. Maine sold a township of public land. It reserved 1,000 acres. That was the public reserved land. That was the public lot. When a proprietor purchased a township, he was supposed to settle it, and there was considerable rules. He had to put a number of families on at a certain time, and they had to build a number of houses to certain specifications, and he had to plow a certain amount of field over 4 years. And the idea behind all of this was that the township of wildland would be, quote, improved, and that a flourishing community would arise there. The public lot was supposed to be held in reserve so that as this new town got going, it would have funds to support its education and its religious needs. Before that time, the lot was held in trust by the state. The practice actually went back to colonial times, but it was codified by the Massachusetts General Court in 1788. And I'll just read that. That there be reserved in each township 4 lots of 320 acres each for public uses, viz. 1 for the first settled minister, 1 for the use of the ministry, 1 for the use of schools, and 1 for the future appropriation of the general court. The said lot to average in goodness and situation with the lands in such township, and to be designated in such way and manner as the said committee shall judge proper. In other words, you couldn't just hive off a piece with the value of the rest of it. Public lots, though, were not just a question of 1,000 acres that the government was holding back. It was critical to what I call the twin pillars of Protestant aspiration: religion and education. They were the most important things for a new town, and the new town itself was also important for the prerequisites of the success of any new state, which was revenue and settlement, and the two were intertwined. So when Maine broke away from Massachusetts, the Commonwealth insisted that this practice be continued, and it was included in the Articles of Separation, and it is in fact still a part of the Constitution today, although it's very rarely printed. The only thing Maine changed was that instead of 4 lots of 320 acres, it was they reserved 1 lot of 1,000 acres. It was just for accounting. Even though it was clear that by mid-century, a lot of towns, particularly in the north of Maine, were simply not going to get settled. The Constitution said that they had to keep reserving that 1,000 acres, and those 1,000 acres were a real headache because they were spread all over the state, as I said, and they were miles away from Augusta, and the land agent simply was not able to police them in any acceptable way, and they became a haven for squatters and for timber pirates. But they couldn't sell them because the Constitution said they couldn't. So Maine did the next best thing. In 1850, they started selling off the rights to harvest the forest, the timber and the grass that were growing on the public lots. And the grass was important because the timber operations used horses and oxen. Generally speaking, it would be the owner of the township that bought the rights to that 1,000 acres. And it was understood that should that township become an incorporated town, the rights to harvest the timber and the grass would expire. So by 1875, there were 400 townships which still had public lots on them. Some of these had been surveyed or located. In other cases, they hadn't been, and the state simply owned 1/23 of the township in a kind of nebulous fashion. And there things sat for 100 years. I call them 100 years of solitude. Lloyd calls them the era of passivity. The timber companies, then followed by the paper companies, harvested the timber, and the state was very happy not to have to worry about taking care of the public lots.
So what happened next?
Well, the next part is the second part of my book, and it gets a little bit complicated. I want to be as quick as possible, but the answer to your question was answered by an executive of the great Northern Paper Company at the time, who said rather pithily, the 400,000 acres or so of wildland in public lots scattered all over the state sat there giving nobody any trouble until they were discovered in 1973 by certain politicians who wished to raise the state flag over them. And so here is what those public lots looked like. I won't go into too much detail, but basically where you see the green dots, those are the public lots that had been located. You could actually find them on the map. The pink shaded hatched areas are those townships where the public lot had never been located, and the state basically owned 1/23 of the township. It always reminds me of a case of measles or chicken pox.
So does your
As
book...
the state raised its flag, yes.
No,
Sorry.
go ahead.
No, can you hold on 1 second? I just got to do one thing.
What do you mean?
I don't know what the time is. I thought I could see it on my computer. But I couldn't.
It's 4:46.
Sorry. Yes. So there we have before the consolidation. To sum up at this point, there was never any question that the state owned the public lots. And there was never any question that the timber paper companies had bought the rights to harvest the timber on it. But in 1970, there were more questions, more uses for land than timberland than perhaps was considered in 1875. One particularly thought so. Bob Cummings, the legendary environmental journalist from the Portland Press Herald and Maine Sunday Telegram. There he is, having just after he retired, he hiked the Appalachian Trail from beginning to end in areas on Mount Katahdin celebrating. He was quite convinced that there were a lot more things that you could do on those 400,000 acres than harvest timber. And so it really is through Bob that the public lots were rediscovered. He passed away in 2016, very sadly, just before I started writing this book, but I had interviewed him about the public lots for another project before. And this is the way he used to tell it about how he discovered them. He was searching for an idea for his regular Sunday feature one day, and he remembered a story he'd been told years before about these public lots and the 1,000 acres being reserved for and held in trust by the state. So he looked into it, and he found those 400,000 lots. And right at that time, Maine was busily trying to play catch up in the public land business, but buying for top dollar land for recreation on lake shore front or on the coast. And what really galled him was that Maine was spending all this money when it was, in fact, it owned 400,000 acres itself, and it was just ignoring those. So he wrote a piece in March 1972, and the banner headline was "Public Land Sold and Given Away." To paraphrase Ralph Waldo Emerson, Bob had just fired the shot heard round the woods. Practically no one in Maine government knew anything about the public lots, and so a young assistant attorney general called Lee Sheps was given the task of finding out what these things actually were and what conceivable rights the state might still have in them. What his report, which became known as the Sheps report, was so incendiary that the Attorney General at the time, his boss, James Owen, tried to suppress it. I think we all know that stonewalling is never a good idea. And in this particular case, it simply reinforced Bob Cummings' commitment to this project and convinced him that indeed he had latched onto something quite important. And for the next 9 years, he wrote constantly about it. Certainly for the next year, he wrote virtually about it. In 1973, a year later, the Sheps report was released to the public. The legislature set up a joint committee to investigate it further. And again, specifically, what were the rights that the state had in the land itself? Remember that the timber and grass rights went away if a township was incorporated into a town. So one way that they might have untangled the knot was to organize all the townships in the unorganized territory. And here's a pretty much back of the envelope sketch that was done at the time to try and organize this area into what was called the Grand Plantations. the paper companies and the large landowners immediately sued, and the Attorney General, John Lunn, countersued using one of Shep's arguments, which was that in fact Maine had sold only the trees standing at the time that they sold the rights, only those growing at the time of the sale. 100 years since, those had been long cut, and that the lumber interests had no right to be cutting those trees any further. The suit effectively closed off legislative action on the public lots, and from then on it was up to the courts, and the forest industry was pretty confident it would prevail. Because of the technical complexities of the issue, the facts were given to a special master or referee who was a respected retired judge. And he was given two issues to decide. Were the cutting rights sold by Maine limited to the timber standing when the rights were sold? And were those rights limited to the size and species of trees considered timber at the time? The special master said no, but the law court, the Maine Supreme Judicial Court, found in favor of the state a couple of years later and decided that the timber interest had been harvesting timber belonging to the state for as many as 100 years. So how was Maine going to be compensated? A group of people got together, realized that it would probably be a lot easier for the companies to pay any reparations in land. They consolidated these 1,000-acre lots into large units, and those large units they carefully chose to represent some of the best and most iconic lands in Maine, which they have been managing for ecological recreation and timber value. So here is, I'm rushing slightly because I want to get on to something. Here is what that case of the chicken pox looked like after consolidation. You can see there are still a few public lots that were not consolidated, but basically you have large areas of land, and on the ground they look like this. This is the Booley Mountain and Booley Lake. McGuntic, very important because this was one of the first places that the famous David Pingree invested in, and his heirs, of course, continued to own 1 million acres, and the Mahoosucs, just to give you a smattering of the beauty of what's there. But now I'd like to get to a little side story that comes in my book that is maybe of particular interest to the Mount Desert Island Historical Society, and it involves Sir Francis Bernard, who was the last civilian confirmed governor of Massachusetts Bay before the Revolution. He became governor in 1760, which was slightly unfortunate because in 1760, George II died and George III took over. Unfortunately, it was George II who had appointed Sir Francis Bernard to the governorship of Massachusetts. And in those days, you bought your permission. So when he died, Sir Francis had to pony up all over again to pay George III for another commission. For whatever reason, the governors of Massachusetts Bay surprisingly, were rather towards the bottom of the colonial salary scale. And it was generally accepted that the Massachusetts General Assembly would vote a grant of land to them for what they called it extraordinary services. Mr. Francis also had, as we've just seen, extraordinary expenses. He came in as a popular governor, but very quickly his popularity slumped. And in fact, it had already slumped when the General Assembly granted him Mount Desert Island, which had recently been ceded by the French to the British. One historian suggests that the grant was not so much for extraordinary services, but was a way of distracting him and diverting his attention from governing the colony. He made an early reconnoitering expedition in Southwest Harbor, particularly struck his fancy as being full of potential. And he made some plans. He was going to lay out a town with its center at the bay's head. Lots of 5 acres were to be counted off on either side, 10 at a time, each one facing the water. The first 60 settlers would be granted an additional outlying lot of 15 acres for farming purposes, and if possible, quotes, an additional 5 acres of salt meadow to lie in common, and if possible, an additional 5 acres, lie in common and to be mowed only and not pastured unless it lies high enough to bear cattle without hurting the land. So he really thought it through a bit. Of the 10 lot parcels, every other one was to be left ungranted, and this again, shades of the education and religion. In one of these sets of reserved 10 lots, Bernard said he proposed to set out lots for a meeting house and school. And one of the pleasantest sets in the center or otherwise, I shall reserve for a settlement of my own. Sadly, it never came to pass. There was a question of jurisdiction, whether Mount Desert Island was part of Massachusetts Bay or Nova Scotia. And by the time all of that was cleared up, King George had signed off on and King George had signed off on the grant. Bernard had in fact been recalled to England, so he never settled Southwest Harbor. After the Revolution, when lands were confiscated from, quote, certain conspirators and absentees, Mount Desert Island was handed over to the Massachusetts Land Committee. The former governor was dead, but his son, John Bernard, petitioned the General Court to reclaim his inheritance. And after, again, in quotes, ample testimony of the uniformity, consistency, and propriety of his political conduct during the hostilities, John Bernard received half his father's lands, half of Mount Desert Island. It sort of becomes rather a sad story because he was unable to make a success of it. According to the famous surveyor, Park Holland, who bumped into the younger Bernard, his family's bad luck during the war was said to have affected his reason. Holland reported that finding him in a small hut of his own erecting with no living creature but a little dog for his companion. Bernard said he intended to build a farm, but the surveyors were skeptical. Poor fellow, we pitied him, wrote the intrepid Holland. He had probably never done a day's work in his life. So that's a sad story. Incidentally, the other half of Mount Desert Island was given to a French lady, Maria Theresa de Gregoire. She was the granddaughter of the Sieur de Cadillac, and the Sieur de Cadillac had been granted Mount Desert Island by Louis XIV. Interesting collision there of absolute monarchy and a new republic. The General Court was at pains to explain that its liberality and generosity in giving her half of Mount Desert Island should not be seen as a precedent. It only wished to, quote, cultivate a mutual confidence and union between the subjects of His Most Christian Majesty and the citizens of this state. So there's a little bit of Mount Desert Island history for you, and I think I probably way overshot my time.
No, we are good on time, and we have a great question in the Q&A. So a question, when Maine acquires a railroad right-of-way for continued rail service, like from Brunswick to Rockland, or for a hiking trail like Ellsworth to Calais, is that right-of-way then included as public land?
Yikes. I would think not, but I've honestly never considered that question. But if the railway presumably owns the rails or makes a deal with the entities that go through it. I mean, the Appalachian Trail is public land owned by the National Park Service, but rails, I honestly don't know. Sorry.
Oh, no worries at all. So we'd like to thank Thomas Urquhart for visiting with us about his new book on Maine public lands and the long and complex history that has been out of sight, oftentimes right under our own 2 feet, and we did not know. So thank you very much for visiting with us today, and we appreciate it.
Well, you're most welcome, and I'm going to steal that thing under our very feet. I like that.
Oh, you're welcome to it.
Thank you.